Dr. John Worth from the University of West Florida is going to do our second program this afternoon, So Far But So Near, Native Refugees in West and South Florida.
Okay, wow. Back again, and I want to talk a little bit, kind of dive into some detail about two areas that I've actually done research in, but also happen to be the kind of northern and southern ends of Spanish Florida, western and southern ends of Spanish Florida. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the context that set up. So some of this will be reviewing what Dr. Milanich already mentioned, but then I'll focus in specifically on those two areas and some of the nifty stuff we've learned about details of how these refugees moved around. So I'll start with, by the way, I have to keep an eye on my phone because my son's in the emergency room, but he's okay. I just need to know what's going on, so. Okay, so looks good. All right, anyway, so let me, back to the Appalachia we just talked about. So this is a map. It looks like just spaghetti flung on a wall, of course, but in reality, what you're seeing there, the homeland of the Appalachia is there. And in 1704, of course, we know that the province was essentially destroyed, overrun. And so basically, the remnants of the Appalachia, well, many people, fled north, west, and east. So I call them the northern band, the eastern band, and the western band. So the eastern band moved east, and these are the group that a fellow named Cuba, the chief, who tried to set up a village south of St. Augustine after having tried to set it up, in the Gainesville area, but ultimately they were destroyed. And so there weren't really that many Appalachia left, and a very small proportion of the mission Indians that went with the East Florida missions. I think, Jerry, what did you mention 5? A very small number actually made it to Cuba. So if we trace the rest of the Appalachia, however, a large band of Appalachia went, and some of them were as slaves who didn't get sold to the English, so they literally lived among the Creek captors. Another group of Appalachia moved over and actually set up new towns, essentially surrounded by their previous enemies, the Creeks. So these, almost like in captive towns, they were sort of in the midst of the rest of the Creeks in English-dominated country. But they stayed there, they maintained their identity. There's even a river in Georgia called the Appalachia River in eastern Georgia, south of Athens, which probably is from that period as well. But they'll play a role later in the westward migration. Then there's the westward group, about 800 Appalachia, along with the Chicato, or the French knew them as Chateau, moved west and stopped in Pensacola, but then eventually a lot of them moved over to Mobile in French territory. So we have the Appalachia split. The western group that went to Pensacola, many of them went to Mobile and stayed. So they essentially became French allied, but nonetheless Catholic mission Indians, but just under the French. Ultimately, though, a group of them stayed with the Spanish. So on the Perdido River, literally right on the boundary between French Louisiana or French Alabama and Spanish Florida, some of the Appalachia stayed allied with the Spanish. So you have two bands of refugee Appalachians right here, and you can see that some of those, the French allied ones, I'm jumping ahead, went to the west after the 1763 war, and the rest of them went down to Veracruz, the Spanish allied. But I'll detail that in a moment. So just sort of setting ourselves up, in the early 18th century, there were basically, well, that's the clusters of remnant mission Indians. You have the groups around St. Augustine, and that bubble, by the way, is far too big. By this time in the early 18th century, they were literally right almost within gunshot of St. Augustine. There was a band, several hundred of Appalachia over there between Pensacola and Mobile, kind of split into at least a couple villages. And then there's another group down here to the south. So I'm just sort of setting up, that's the early 18th century. Later, what we do see is there are remnants of the South Florida Indians that sort of move back from both the south and the north and become Costas Indians, which are remnant South Florida Indians of many groups. And another group called the Keys Indians, which is mostly Calusa, of course, and descendants of these guys here. And some of the Yamasee that had been slavers eventually join around St. Mark's, a new fort built by the Spanish, and they also eventually join in with the Appalachia. But I'll detail all that later. This is just mainly to provide some broad context, sort of geopolitical. And I should highlight while I'm pointing this out, these Creek were, and to some extent the Chickasaw, but really the Creek were the primary aggressors during the 1685 to 1715 period. And I guess the map back there shows that also this group, the Yamasee, before 1715 was also accompanying them in raids. The Cherokee later raided as slavers, but in different areas mostly. And the Chickasaw mostly raided the Mississippi Valley and the Choctaw, and they were allies as well. In this era, it's an ironic thing. Most of the Native American groups that still survive today were slavers for the English at one time or another, or participants in that trade. Most of the groups who weren't slavers for the English are extinct. I mean, it's not a coincidence. It was guns and slaves and a massive market for those that ultimately fueled the depopulation and reorientation of the whole Southeast. And to a certain extent, I think I could make the argument that the reason I'm speaking English today in Florida is precisely because of the slave trade, the firearms revolution. Anyway, so let's show. Now, as we move out into West Florida, just to show you the status in the mid-18th century, what you see here is that France had now spread from the mouth of the Mississippi River, had set up Mobile here. So this is French Louisiana, the whole Mississippi Valley. They had forts in the interior, Fort Toulouse among the creek, Fort Tombecpe to the north, kind of between the Choctaw and Chickasaw. And then Spain, of course, on the west side had moved in from Texas. So the Texas missions were actually contemporaneous with this period. And then, of course, Spain is also bordered to the north on the east by England, Charleston, essentially. So that's Spanish Florida in the mid-18th century. Now, just to show you kind of where we're going to focus on, Pensacola is an afterthought to the Spanish colonial era in the sense that it was only actually established as a permanent colony in 1698. So most of the stuff we've been talking about here had already happened by the time Pensacola was established. And Pensacola went through sort of a rough amount of events. Santa Maria was the original settlement. It lasted only about 20 years. Then the French came in and took it, and the Spanish took it back, and the French took it back and burned it before the Spanish would want it back. Anyway, after that war, they came back and decided they didn't want to set up here. They set up here on Santa Rosa Island. And subsequently, after a big hurricane basically just wiped them off the map, they relocated to what is now downtown Pensacola, 1756. So that's the context of the Spanish settlements. The native groups in the Pensacola, the West Florida area, right around Pensacola, originally were known as, strangely enough, Pensacola. That's a native group that basically went extinct as a group, largely at least as a functioning distinct group, by 1700. There were very few left by the time the Spanish actually set up shop. Then, very briefly, very shortly, right after that, in 1704, we see the influx of several hundred Appalachi from the east. And the reason Pensacola needed Indians is that there were notice the Pensacola were gone, and they had nobody around as sentinels, as hunters, as trading partners. It was basically a hinterland. So the Appalachi provided the new group of Indians in the Pensacola area after 1704. And like I said, though, some of them went to the French. Then after 1718, after the Yamasee War, all those Creeks that had been, or all those Appalachi who had been enslaved by the Creek, moved back into Spanish territory. When the Creeks rebelled against the English, the Appalachi came back, and so did the Yamasee. In any case, so a massive influx of several hundred Appalachi under a chief named Juan Marcos Hispani, who was born about 1690 in Tallahassee area, set up shop and brought in a lot of the French allied Appalachi. So there's a long period when the Appalachi now are the local Indians of Pensacola. So all of the workers, I don't know how I did that. All of the workers in the Pensacola area were actually being paid food and essentially fed and kept up at Spanish cost. Now, this over here is the Yamasee, who, as Jerry mentioned before, were mostly clustered around St. Augustine, but when General James Oglethorpe came in and burned St. Augustine, laid siege to it in 1740, a lot of the Yamasee were very disillusioned, and they just picked up shop and went west to Pensacola. And so they made a second group of Indians in this area. So I'll show you these towns, and note that there's a brief entrance of Upper Creeks into the area during a brief period of peace, which was broken very quickly. So these are the missions. These are the refugee missions around Pensacola. There's actually several locations. As Dr. Marinan mentioned before, you can't say that a mission stayed in one place all the time. So what you're seeing here, for example, is the Appalachi originally settled here on the Perdido River. And I'm not 100% sure where, they may have lasted there longer. And then later when Juan Marcos Hispane came in, he set up shop here, literally on the UWF campus where I work. Although we've only found traces, we're not 100% sure exactly where it is. I think it's under one of our parking lots. And then upriver is another site that I searched for and found back in 2009. It's the last Appalachian mission to be set up. And then another mission, the Yamasee mission, originally was located probably here, and then later they moved over here. And that mission was found last summer by a student of mine who helped me find that mission. So we now have both archaeological sites. And anyway, they're being studied. To show you the context of this, you can see here the Creeks, who are English allied for the most part. Their neighbors, the Alabamos, who are the French allied part of the Upper Creek province. And then, of course, there's all these lower French towns, native towns, Mobilians, Naniaba, the Tome, and some of the Appalachie. So there's twin Appalachie towns. There's the Spanish Appalachie, there's the French Appalachie. And that's important because the French Appalachie are the one that survived to today. Okay, and these are two creek towns that were set up briefly when there was peace, a formal peace treaty in Pensacola with the French, or rather with the Creek Indians. Okay. Just to show you what a refugee mission looked like, this is 1741 San Josef de Escambe. You may have noticed on the Appalachian mission maps that were shown before, there was a mission called Escambe in Appalachia. I mean, in the original homeland in Tallahassee. So the village was very small. In this case, it's only 30 to 50 Christian Appalachie. So the interesting thing, though, is that these people chose to be next to the Spanish. That's what, when I say so near but so far, all of these groups I'm talking about didn't join with the Spanish and assimilate, nor did they run away from the Spanish and go native or run away from Europeans and become indigenous fully. They hung around on the margins of other Spanish territories. So in this case, this small group under Juan Marcos stayed among the Spanish, but every time the Spanish got a little closer, they'd move upriver. So they were keeping their distance, they were trading with the Creek, but they were also getting their sacraments from the priest in the Franciscan friar in Pensacola. And you know, it's a very small group. We've actually found this stockade walled archaeologically where they sent cavalry unit up to set up shop in this village. But what's important from our purposes here is that it was burned when the Creeks, well, it was a brief war for about 10 months in 1761, in which case both of these missions I'm talking about were destroyed. And we got a lot of great documentation. The interesting thing about this Pensacola area is Pensacola was not a colony of Spain. It was a colony of Mexico, of New Spain, meaning it was supplied out of Veracruz, Mexico. The people inhabiting it came out of Veracruz, Mexico. Its diet included mostly like Mexican chiles, and it was very different than the Spanish Florida of East Florida. But these are some of the documents, and for my purposes, to go and learn about these missions, you have to go to Mexico City, not to Seville. Well, I mean, there's some in Seville too, but Mexico City has quite a bit, and these are photographs of their original signatures. This is the Friar Antonio de Silva, who was there when the mission was burned, and he led all of the congregants out into the woods in the middle of the night, keeping them safe. So the war that occurred, pardon me, was several attacks. The Alabamos, well, first the Tallapooses. Well, there was a small group of Creeks who were upset over bad treatment by the governor. Sounds familiar, right? In Pensacola. So they murdered the entire family of the lieutenant stationed at this Yamasee mission. And very shortly thereafter, the adjacent Upper Creek town came and burned the whole mission to the ground. And within 2 months, the Escambe mission, the Appalachie, were attacked by the Alabamas. And that particular Alabama chief, a guy named Mestizo, had a feud with the lieutenant who was stationed at the mission. He had traded him, well, let's just put it this way. He had given him some brandy, and gotten him drunk, and traded away a horse and a big fancy jacket. And then when he woke up with his hangover, he said he wanted it back, and the guy refused and threatened, he said, you got to go or I'll kill you. And then the Indian said, the chief said, well, kill me here, because if not, I'm going to come back and I'm going to put you and your horse under that tree over there. Anyway, the point is they did come back, and they did destroy the mission. And thanks to that, we found it, because it shows up on a later map. Anyway, in the aftermath, you see the Creeks moved back, and these two missions consolidated. And I think I've got a map. There's the remnant. That's how I found the mission, along with some other evidence. But the British were still aware of the mission because its ruined remnants were still there up north. Anyway, it's just exactly where it should have been, though many people had looked. We just had never had any luck. So the last two missions here eventually consolidated into one pueblo right outside Pensacola. And when the British moved in, they later knew this as Indian Town. But we have the archaeological site of that as well. It's on the east side of modern-day Pensacola. Modern-day Pensacola, of course, incorporates all of this. But basically, if you know Pensacola, Seville Square is over here, and that's where Indian Town is. So that's where they were at the time of the end of the French and Indian War, which was 1756 to 1763. And that's the context within which this Creek raiding occurred. Now, the reason that's important is that in 1763, in order to get Havana back, the English had taken it, Spain traded away Florida. It was part of the bigger deal. So the Pensacola Indians ended up, all 108 of them, including Apalachee and Yamasee, moved to Veracruz, Mexico with the Spanish. That's the list, the original list, and that right there is the hand signature of Andrés Escudero, who was the 35-year-old chief of the Yamasee. But this includes all the different groups and the various families of Yamasee and Apalachee. There's Juan Marcos el Cacique. That's the Apalachee chief there. Anyway, they went to Veracruz, but in Veracruz, eventually the Spanish actually allotted them land on a ranch. This is an old map, and that's the modern map. And they set them up an actual town called San Carlos de Chachalacas. That town still exists today. So this town was started by Yamasee and Apalachee Indians who were resettled from Pensacola. That being said, the documents show me that, and this is the downtown area. You see the church and various blocks around the plaza. That plaza is still there too. I've walked around down there and looked, and the archaeologist for Veracruz has said, anytime we want to come down there, maybe we can dig. That would be very cool. Anyway, the point, though, is that there were only, out of 80 some odd that made it up there, eventually there were only 47, and then down to 20, and a lot of Africans from the local area began to flow into the village too. And so it became an African, Mexican Indian, Florida Indian, Yamasee, Apalachee community. And so today they don't have any, as far as we know, any conscious awareness of their ancestry. So I can't say for sure if they have ancestors who are Apalachee, but they might. Anyway, the point is that the parish records for that area were all burned in the 1920s. I talked to the parish priest, and so as far as I know, we won't be getting that information. Okay, so let me go back to here. I told you, and we know about this, so I'm going to jump to the next. That's some of the same pictures I robbed off the internet too. So anyway, so let's move to South Florida. What do I got? 10 minutes-ish? I just want to make sure I'm.
You got 20 minutes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you've only taken 10.
Is that right? All right, cool. I was distracted earlier, so I'm in the groove. All right, cool. Well, I knew that this was we're in Southwest Florida, so. When I'm talking about refugees in South Florida, in this case, the Calusa were never consistent. We wouldn't call them mission Indians. There were missions to the Calusa, and what you'll see here is kind of a chronology, and you'll see what I did with the colors. What I'm trying to demonstrate with this is that from 1500 to 1760, which is when the last Calusa left Florida, and I'm pretty convinced of that. Anyway, most of the time they were isolated from the Spanish. And the only times that they were actually engaged with the Spanish, from Ponce de Leon's arrival, his attempted colony, the brief 3-year fort that Menendez set up on Mound Key itself, most of the time was pretty hostile. In other words, the Spanish and Calusa did not get along very well. And when the Spanish were allowed in, it was mostly through coercion or enticement. And the Calusa were always very anti-Spanish. And that probably stems from the fact that when Ponce de Leon first arrived here, they had already received immigrants, refugees from Cuba, who had been through one of the most brutal parts of the Caribbean Spanish conquest on Cuba in 1511. So the Calusa knew all about the badness of the Spanish at that time, because the Spanish at that time didn't really outlaw slaving against Indians until the 1540s. So later Spanish Florida, the Spanish were not slaving, but in this period they were. Therefore, the Calusa established a policy of kill them when you can. Literally they attacked Ponce de Leon within 24 hours of anchoring and waiting for them. Anyway, so what we're looking at here is a long period in which the Calusa official national policy, so to speak, was don't let the Spanish in, capture and kill them when you can. Any chief that lets them close would be executed. They know that because the Spanish attempted one expedition in 1680. So in the end, however, in 1688, Cuban fishermen operating out of Regla, Cuba, just outside of Havana, on Havana Harbor, began to fish these waters, and they apparently reached some sort of a deal with the Calusa. For one thing, the Calusa numbers had dropped precipitously. We know there were something like 22,000 at the time of Menendez, and then by 1698, 7, when the Franciscans arrived, there were only 2,000. Part of that may be due to political fragmentation, but maybe 90% population loss. So the point, though, is that they were getting totally cut off, and they were now apparently in need of Spanish contact. So the policy changed, and the Calusa chief actually agreed to be brought to Havana and be baptized. This was in 1688. In order to test the waters, he sent like 150 Calusa Indians to live in Havana for a year and a half, and they stayed there, and then they brought him back, and that was proof that it was safe. The Spanish weren't going to kill him. And so they did actually bring the Calusa chief back, and he was baptized. Unfortunately, that section of the baptismal record in the cathedral archives doesn't exist, so I haven't been able to find where he was baptized, but the documents say he was. His name was Felipe II. They always took the name of Spanish kings. I think it was Felipe II. Anyway, the point is they adopted the name Felipe. Okay, so my point, though, is the Calusas stayed away from the Spanish, and then they basically switched 180 degrees and started to reach out to them. Now this very gross, meaning it's not very refined map, but it shows you the broader kind of cultural realm at the time we're talking about, particularly the South Florida area, at least prior to the slave raids. So this kind of shows you this is mid-17th century, so this is prior to the arrival of the slave raids. And what you'll see in the next slide, and that's from the Randall Research Center Calusa Heritage Trail. That shows one of the slave raids by Yamasees against the South Florida Indians. And that all occurred within a very brief period of time. The reason for that is that South Florida had been insulated nicely from the rest of the Southeast turmoil in this time period. So, mayhem had not been able to get to the farther south than the wall of missions. So Apalachee, Yustaga, Timucua, Patano, and of course St. Augustine represented, number one, a source of slaves for the Creek and Yamasee raiders, but number two, a wall against which the Creeks and Yamasees weren't penetrating to the south. Therefore, the fact that all of these groups mostly kept the Spaniards at bay, and they were protected from the raiding of the English allied Indians, they were protected all the way until 1704 to 1706. Because the Apalachee fell in 04, Yustaga fell in 05, Timucua and Patano in 05 late, and then the last mission in Salamatoto on north of Palatka fell in 1706. So by May of 1706, there was nobody. So the wall is gone, and between 1704, when that wall began to open, and 1711, a 7-year period, we have reports from the governor that he had received reports that something like 10,000 South Florida Indians had been carted off into slavery. And what happened was that they were totally unprotected. We have one account of a raid by Thomas Nairn in 1707, and he talks about going down with 30 Yamasee warriors armed with flintlocks, and they went up against a Calusa village, well, a South Florida Indian village. They captured all the women, and then the men were gone, but then they counterattacked later. But they counterattacked with spears tipped with shell. Oh, I mean, it was something like that in the account. It's not real precise, but the point is they slaughtered the men, and then they just took the rest of the women up. I mean, that was how the slave trade went. It was an imbalance of power that allowed the slave traders, the slave raiders, to make such progress. So what happened to the South Florida Indians? They didn't all get captured. So basically from a line, here to here, like from somewhere around Venice over to wherever that is, Jupiter, whatever, that area to the north, most of those people fled north to St. Augustine and became a new mission population. Now remember, these are different Indians. These are people who had not been missionized prior to this. So they're unconverted, no experience with missionization, and for the most part, they are non-agricultural. They're hunter-gatherers, they're fisher folk. So they're very transient, and they don't end up staying year-round, and the Franciscans were not particularly happy. But they do end up going up there, and so a lot of the refugees end up in St. Augustine. The rest of them, including all the Calusa, the Muspa, the Tequesta, who originally were from Miami, fled across the Everglades and down to the Miami area and into the Keys. Because the Yamasee were not going to raid that far across that wetland. At least that's my impression. All right, so that's what's going on right at the time when the Yamasee War breaks out. And you see, some of the South Florida Indians are up here, and some of the South Florida Indians are down here called Keys Indians. In 1711, there was an attempt during this period. Things were so bad, and the Bishop of Cuba knew about it, and the Cuban fishermen actually took 270 South Florida Indians, including 50 Calusa Indians, to Cuba as a way of saving them. And they left something like 6,000, I think there was an estimate, in Florida. So the point is the Spanish were attempting to bring the Calusa and the rest of the South Florida Indians, the Keys Indians, to save them in Havana from the Yamasee depredations. Unfortunately, it didn't work out too well. Both Calusa chiefs, the Calusa chief and his heir, both died during the brief stay in Cuba. And I think only 16 or 18 were farmed out to local families to try to save their lives, and then the rest were just brought back to South Florida. So in other words, they took them to Cuba, tried to save them, didn't work out so well, they just took them right back. And the people who are doing all this, by the way, is Cuban fishermen. Small fleet of boats that's going up and fishing in the winter in Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound. So that's one time. So we know the names of a lot of these people. What I find interesting is that when I look at the documentation, in the 1560s, the Carlos chief, the original Calusa chief that gave the name Carlos, well, that the Spanish attributed to the province, the new chief was named Felipe. Well, decades and decades later, in 1697, the chief is named Felipe, and then in 1710, he's named Felipe, and those two, or at least the second one, Felipe, is the one who dies in Cuba. And there's never again any reference to a Felipe who's chief of the Keys Indians. Remember, they took the Calusa back, but the ones who stayed, the original locals were Tequesta. And the original Tequesta chief name, I keep doing that, was Diego. So I wonder if Diego represents, and the fact that Diego, after the Calusa's chief's death, means that the Tequesta noble lineage took preeminence, and the extinction of the official Calusa lineage in Cuba represented sort of a shift in power. Most of the Keys Indians were probably, a lot of them at least were Calusa, but nonetheless, a new lineage succeeds them. All right, so what happens then? Remember, Yamasee War, the slave trade dies out largely after that point. The Yamasees flee back to Spanish Florida. The Creeks run away to their homeland. The English are no longer doing this degree of slaving. And so for this brief respite, some of the Costas Indians began moving down to the East Coast. Some of these guys didn't used to live there, but now they do. And then some of the ones who were still living, in this area began to move north. And so the Mayaimi, the Mayaca, different names that shouldn't be there, but they are during this brief interim. Anyway, so Carlos, Boca Ratones, that's where Boca Raton comes from today, Boca Raton. So we have that period, the Costas and the Keys. The Costas are interacting with St. Augustine. The Keys Indians are interacting with Cuba. So the Cuban fishing industry, you can see, the Cuban fishermen came up every winter in November and left by Lent, and they sold their catch in Lent. Havana's inhabitants ate their fish during Lent, which was a lot, from Florida. Their own waters were not sufficient for them, nor particularly good, so they liked South Florida. So what happens is the Creeks are still raiding, and particularly during the era of the French and Indian War, what you begin to see is that the Creeks do indeed begin to penetrate, and the remnants of these groups, some of them flee back north, some of them flee back to the south. But let's see. Let me move on to this. These look like the vessels. These are the types of vessels that they used in this. So the Calusa are not going back and forth to Cuba on their own. I've only found one instance when the Calusa actually took their own canoes. And that was when the Creeks were literally pushing them off the continent, and they fled. But everybody else that I could see was sailing on Spanish fishing vessels. And here's what the Cubans called South Florida. After the British took over, they technically didn't own Florida, so they just called it Los Cayos del Norte. And the British didn't do anything to secure that area. So essentially, South Florida and West Florida, the Costa de Tampa, all of these areas, Sanibel was named during this period. All of that area was in the domain of Cuban fishermen, totally unpatrolled by the British. And the Indians down there later became creeks. But during this initial period, what they would do is they would sail out of Havana. They would hire Calusa Indians and Keys Indians here. They would then sail up to the Southwest Florida coast and use them in fishing. Then they'd bring them back, and they'd live, in their homelands in the Keys. So in the French and Indian War, the one that wiped out our Pensacola missions, there were several attacks where the Creeks were not only raiding Spanish-connected Indians, they actually raided against Cuban fishermen. So literally, there was an attack against a Cuban fishing vessel in Pine Island Sound area around Sanibel, another one here in the River of Ais. So those are the dates that I can document the Creeks are becoming bold enough. They would literally just surprise a canoe or a fishing vessel and shoot them up. They captured a Chinese slave. I didn't even know there were Chinese slaves in this period, but they did, right next to a place that today is called Chino Island. I don't know if that's the origin, but it could be. And Captiva Island, means captive. It could relate to this period when the Creeks are during the French and Indian War raiding. So what happens? Well, in May 18th, I think, of 1760, the Creeks made a final assault. The Keys Indians had gradually gone from Miami and literally there was one village left of Keys Indians in Key West as of 1760. The governor of Havana had provided them guns, flintlock muskets. He had built them a boat. He assigned them and paid a guy to be their commissioner of the Keys Indians, a guy named Sayas. Anyway, the point is that they were all trying to help the Calusa stay in Florida because the last thing they wanted was only British Allied Indians in South Florida. Because what would happen to the Spanish shipwreck survivors? And we know, wouldn't be good. So the point, though, is that when the Creeks attacked Key West, they dropped the guns on the battlefield, got in their canoes, and sailed on their own, and I guess maybe in the boat, too. Anyway, they came into Havana Harbor, and they said, we're done. Take us. We're going to settle wherever you'll put us. And they never went back. So where did they put them? Well, the original spot in Havana, this is modern Havana Harbor. There's a fort right there. Anyway, it's called La Cabaña, and it's a high bluff on the opposite side, right next to the mouth of the harbor. That's where they had originally set up the 1688 test village when the chief was going to come up. And so that's where they brought the remnant Calusa, and they settled them in La Cabaña once again. But strangely enough, ironically enough, when the British came in to take Havana in 1762, where did they set up their locations to bombard from? Right on La Cabaña. And I've been wanting to go through British records and see if they mention anything about local Indians that just happened to be there, or did they just push them off the bluff, and I don't even know. But the point is that after the British took Havana using La Cabaña, the site of the Calusa refugees, the Spanish built this massive fort. I think it's the actual biggest masonry fort in the entire Caribbean. That's what they say in Cuba, at least. It's a nice fort to visit. It's really beautiful, but it's huge, and it's sitting on top of the archaeological site of where the Calusa refugees would have lived, probably. I don't know. Maybe someday we'll know. In any case, after that, where did they move them? Well, they moved them to Guanabacoa. So in other words, from the remnant village at La Cabaña, after the British took Havana, when the Spanish got it back, they resettled the remnant Calusa in Guanabacoa, the same village that had all the rest of the Eastern Florida Indians, mission Indians. And I was there in 2003, 4, and 5 and did a lot of mining through the archives. This is every native of the Keys or South Florida Indians that I was able to find between 1679 and I went all the way up to about 1780. So the point is that there are quite a few. A lot of these people would have been from the earlier periods, but some of them are late. But what's interesting is right here, in 1729, Maria Antonia, daughter of Leonor de Sayas, a native of Carlos, which is the Calusa realm, and a second daughter, Maria Casilda, same woman. Note, Leonor, native of the Keys, she died at age 50 in 1766. So that may be the same person, it may not. She'd be awful young, but nonetheless, that may be her daughters. This would be the first and only so far evidence we have of Calusa children being born in Cuba, who therefore might have living descendants. Clearly, they're dead by now, but their descendants may live on. And there were rumors in the 1830s that there were still remnants of the South Florida Indians living there in Havana. So, to sum up, the Appalachian Yamasee, and I'm talking most of the Appalachia that existed, Some of them went to San Carlos de Chachalacas, a village that still exists in Mexico, just north of Veracruz. The rest of the Appalachee, the ones that were attached to the French, moved west and are still living in Louisiana, and apparently, from what I gathered now, also have some Chacato neighbors, or Chateau. And then the Keys Indians, of course, eventually ended up in Guanabacoa, just like the rest of the Florida Mission Indians. Death rate was high. Most of them died very quickly, but I've got grandchildren of the East Florida Mission Indians being born as late as 1790 something, so there's no doubt in my mind that somewhere among the Guanabacoa population, modern-day Havana suburbs, there are living descendants of both the East Florida Indians and the South Florida Indians as well. And I'd guess Veracruz, too. We probably have some of our Appalachee descendants there, too. So maybe someday we'll figure this out, if only through genetic evidence. All right, I'm wrapped. Any questions? Do we have time? Or? Okay.
We have lots of time for questions.
Oh, did I wrap up too early?
Nope. You did perfect.
Yeah. John.
You gotta use the microphone, John.
Oops. Ooh.
Yeah, John, what about, I know a story about Chicaica. Can you elaborate on possibly any traces of Calusas in his bloodline or in his remedy?
All right, well, I mean, what John's talking about, his question was about an Indian named Chicaica, who was one of the group of Spanish Indians. Chicaica emerged in history in the Second Seminole War, 1837 or so. He was in charge of the massacre at Harney Flats, I believe, anyway, on the Calusa-Hatchie River. Some sources suggest that Chicaica, because he was tall and he was a South Florida Indian called a Spanish Indian, must be a descendant of the Calusa. But I did a lot of research on this, a ton of research. I even got an article in Historical Archaeology on all of this. But the point is that Chicaica seems to be a part Creek, part Spanish or Cuban descendant. He was known as Antonio Nicaica or Chicaica prior to the Second Seminole War, and he was a pilot on a U.S. vessel. So he shows up on the actual lists, apparently, according to one of the U.S. Congressional Record documents I have. So the point is Chicaica was one of the Spanish Indians in the 1830s when the U.S. government rounded up the rest of the Spanish Indians as if they were Seminole and literally carted them out, through Tampa Bay and shipped them out with the rest of the Seminole during the removal period. Now, the husbands of these women and children who were sent to Oklahoma as Seminoles made a petition against the Spanish crown, or U.S. government, sorry, I don't know what country I'm in, against the U.S. government saying, these Spanish Indians are not Seminoles. They were living with us. They are cousins of the Creeks, but they have nothing to do with them. They weren't part of the rebellion. They don't even know how to farm. They're fishermen, so they're coastal Spanish Indians. Now, when the American government rounded up all the Spanish Indians they could, apparently one band of Spanish Indians who didn't want to go quietly decided to go join the Seminoles. And Chicaica was the leader of that band. So my interpretation of the way the documents run is that Chicaica led rebel Spanish Indians to join with the Seminoles when the Seminole War, the Second Seminole War, had almost died down. And he fanned the flames and brought it back to life. And he got 2 more years of warfare through 1839. And the U.S. government hunted him down in the Everglades and finally caught up with him. And I think they shot him and then strung him up, or strung him up and then shot him or something, That's it. So the point, though, is that his wives and various members who did survive the attack, and they even destroyed Indian Key, I think, during this period. Anyway, Chicaica was killed, but his relatives, the rest of the Spanish Indians, were brought out to Oklahoma. And I talked to a guy. We have a list of them. In fact, you sent me, I think, a list you found years ago. The point is that their descendants still know that they descend from Spanish Indians in the Seminole Nation. The cultural resource protection officer for the Seminoles back 10 years ago told me that his personal family tradition among the Seminoles is that he descends from Spanish Indians. So Chicaica's band, or the other groups that were rounded up prior to Chicaica's rebellion, are still, out there in Seminole country, in the Seminole Reservation. So yeah, my interpretation is Chicaica is a rebel Spanish Indian who tried to resist just like the Seminoles. I don't think he has any Calusa ancestry. Everything I say, including everything I see, including the documents from the 1760s, say that literally the last Calusa left Florida in May of 1760. And part of the reason I know that is because that when a Spanish ship ran aground or stopped for water in Key West in 1762, they were captured by Indians. But they brought them back up to the Creek country. It was Creek Indians who were already on Key West by that time. And they were capturing everybody they could. So again, I really don't think the Calusa lasted in South Florida after 1760. That being said, the Creeks captured Calusa Indians as slaves prior to 1711. Not all those slaves may have been sold. They may have married them, adopted them, brought them into their society. Therefore, the Creeks of the 1760s, some of them probably had ancestors who were Calusa, captives. That's my interpretation. There are those who would argue with that. So, do we have any other questions, any thoughts?
We have one online, but I'll go to Seal Spuler here first.
What I would like to know, I remember I've heard you speak before when you were down in Cuba, looking at some papers, hoping to find some descendants. Mm-hmm. Now that we can get in there easier, do you have any plans to see if there are any descendants?
Plans, all right, ideas, yes. Specific plans, no, though. Partly because my life has taken many turns in different directions. In the last 10 years, of course, I've been working in Pensacola, and we just found the Tristan da Luna settlement, and that has absorbed my life. However, that being said, because of the new political circumstances, I would love to be involved in, maybe not personally, but having students down there working on that sort of stuff. And I got so much data that I've never published that I'd love to get out. I don't know. But yes, I would love to do it, but I don't have time to do it right now. I'm hoping somebody else will digitize the records and maybe I can see it online. Actually, I can do research on Cuban archives right now from my home. You can do it right here on an internet connection. Vanderbilt University and what's Texas A&M? No. It's a Texas. Anyway, Vanderbilt University, Jane Lander.
He's in
Arlington.
Arlington.
Okay. Texas, right? Okay, Arlington, Texas. So anyway, there's a project that back in the 2005 era, right after I was in Cuba, they went through and photographed most of the non-white sacramental registries. And therefore, a lot of that stuff's available online. But you really got to know your script. And it's been eaten by bookworms, and it's in really bad shape. So I have a heck of a time. But I've found a lot of Creek Indians and Florida Indians online since I went to Cuba. So you don't have to necessarily be in Cuba, but there's definitely stuff left to be found. Yes. Teresa.
Speaking of Cuba, we have over 80 people watching this presentation online.
Wow.
And one of them is a Cuban archaeologist, Odlanier Hernandez.
Oh.
And he's asking you and Jerry if it's possible to access information about the last Appalachia in Cuba.
Access, like right now, all we have are publications, like books that have mentioned. I personally have I didn't put it up in my presentation, but I have inventoried every single Florida mission Indian that went to Cuba. I've got them numbered by person and family, by group, and I've every other reference to them and their kids and their grandkids. So my point is I will easily share any of that stuff with whoever's interested. So if you can communicate back to the gentleman that I would love to send everything I've got, and I'll try to find those Appalachia references. They're not many, but there's a few.
Trey is going to be typing that.
Great. So the key is just email me and I'll send stuff.
Absolutely.
I share everything I've got. I mean, that's the only way we proceed in research is by just sharing information. So.
And Jerry, do you have anything to add to that? Because he called you out by name too.
What's your email, John?
It's jworth@uwf.edu.
And
Lord.
I'll ask a separate question. So of the slave raiding that's happening early on, where are the Indians in northern Florida that are sold back to the British? Where is it that they end up going? What places do they go to? And has anybody attempted to trace those movements of people?
Well, we have some clues. There's a historian named Alan Gallay, who has done a whole book called Indian Slavery, I believe it is. But he's traced the British side of the records. But as I understand it, at least, when they become possessions, when they become slaves of the British, there's not a lot of specificity as where they came from. So in other words, by that time, they're just slaves. And maybe the best you're ever going to get is Indios, or not in the British records. But for example, in some of the records I've looked at, and it's in my book on the Georgia coast, the raiders who took from the Timucua, from Afuica, Santa Catalina de Afuica or Ahoica, went to Santa Elena, anyway, to South Carolina, and there was an Irish ship, and they sold a certain number of those slaves to an Irish ship captain who just bought the slaves without even being in South Carolina. So I would love to track that down. But the documentary evidence suggests that many of the slaves that were taken by Carolinian traders were taken to Barbados and other places in the West Indies, partly because they couldn't escape there. The bad news about there's no good news about the slave trade, the Indian slave trade, but Florida Indians, Southeastern Indians made really poor slaves. They were susceptible to disease. They were not apparently as vigorous in the climates they were sent to, for example, so they died very quickly. The people who made money on the slave trade were the raiders, who got a lot of trade goods, guns, gunpowder, and lead balls from the Carolina traders, and the traders. In other words, the guys who bought the slaves and then sold them to the final destination made their money. It didn't matter whether they lived afterwards. So the point is, this slave trade, the Native American slave trade in the Southeast, lasted about 55, 60 years, and it was a natural end to it. That was the end. As terrible as it was self-limiting. So
And then just to continue to follow where everything went then, so those slavers, as they came down to the Central Florida and everything, are they today's Seminoles then?
Indirectly, yes, in the sense that there's a gap. Like when the slave raids were going on, I mean, they didn't stay down there. They made camps. The Yamasee and the Creek, who were slaving in the peninsula, went down there for short times. They brought back their slaves. They lived up in Georgia, South Carolina, and to some extent Alabama. So essentially, after the slave trade began to diminish, those same Creeks living in Georgia and Alabama, after the Yamasee War, began to move into North Florida, first around Tallahassee, to some extent over to the Apalachicola River. Then, in 1763, the British took over Florida, and all of a sudden, a whole flood of what used to be temporary Creeks who came to hunt and trade flooded into the plains of newly British Florida and settled. North Florida Creeks, who traded with the British, became the Seminoles of today. The Coweta band of the Creeks, the lower Creeks, seem to have preferred the Gulf Coast and going way down and avoiding the British trade, but during the British period, they traded with the Cuban fishing vessels. So the Spanish allied or Cuban allied Creeks became the Spanish Indians. The British allied Creeks, for the most part, became the Seminoles. And ultimately, they were all lumped together later by the U.S. government, and they live together today. But that seems to be the story of their origin. I'm probably glossing over lots of finicky detail, but as a general rule, I think what I said is reasonable.